There tends to be a lot of frustration with CPU reviews. A lot of people get frustrated with, oh, they're using unrealistic settings, like a 4090 at 1080p. But that makes perfect sense when you're reviewing a CPU. So then a lot of people are saying, telling people they're dumb if they're asking things like, oh, I want to see this tested at 1440p or 4K or that kind of thing. And I actually don't think either of those people are dumb. I think what they want is an answer to a different question than what the CPU review is trying to answer. So here's what I mean by that. In other words, I think a lot of people who click on a CPU review want an answer to this question. How would upgrading to this CPU impact my gaming experience? That's the question a lot of people want to know the answer to. But that is absolutely not the question that a CPU reviewer is trying to answer in a CPU review. A CPU reviewer is trying to answer the question, how fast are these CPUs relative to each other? And then that implication of that is when they're CPU limited, because otherwise you wouldn't see any difference. Now, you see that these are definitely not the same question, but I also think that this is the question that CPU reviews should be answering. So let me explain what's going on here, and then let's do some pondering about how would you answer this question? Because I do think that is the question that a lot of people want answered when they click on a CPU review. So first of all, okay, so if a CPU reviewer's job is to figure out how fast are CPUs relative to each other, then you need to create a CPU limited scenario, right? So if I scroll up here on my whiteboard, we can see I talked recently in a bottleneck, the bottleneck paradox video about how changing graphic settings and using different GPUs and things like that can create a bottleneck of either the CPU or the GPU. Changing rendering resolution reduces the burden on the GPU, but generally leaves the CPU bottleneck kind of about the same. Whereas, turning on or off certain graphic settings can affect the load on the GPU and sometimes the CPU. The point is that, whether you're CPU or GPU limited is kind of complicated. And if you put in a better CPU, but your performance was limited by your GPU, so you were just waiting for your CPU anyway, the CPU was just waiting for the GPU anyway, then you're not going to see any difference between CPUs. And so obviously a CPU reviewer isn't going to do that. However, a viewer might want the answer to that exact question. Hey, if I put a faster CPU into my system, would I even notice a difference? Right? Because if the answer is no, then why would they get the faster CPU? You see what I'm saying, right? But for the CPU reviewer, it would be pretty boring to have a video where I just say, hey, these CPUs produce the same experience on this graphics card at these settings because we're not CPU limited, right? that would be a bad CPU review because it wouldn't show how different they can be, if that makes sense, right? So in other words, when CPU reviewers do stuff like use an RTX 4090 at 1080p resolution, and people call that out as unrealistic, it is unrealistic, but it's also correct if you're trying to answer this question. You need to make sure, if we look at this GPU CPU thing, you need to make sure when you're plugging in these CPUs that your GPU river of FPS is extremely wide. Because you need to and this is why you would do like an RTX 4090 at 1080p. Because then if I have a CPU that can only offer FPS at that width, right? That amount of FPS, but then the new CPU comes out, we'll do this one in blue, and it can offer a river at that width. You can measure how much, additional frames per second are flowing, right? On this, by plugging in this new CPU, right? But if we look at this same kind of situation where maybe the viewer has this, this red CPU, and then the viewer doesn't have an RTX 4090, and they play at a higher rendering resolution. So maybe, let me go backwards. Maybe their GPU can only actually produce frame rates at this level. And then they think, ooh, I'm going to buy that blue CPU because the reviewer just told me, it's like 20% faster, right? So then the viewer goes ahead and buys this, right? So they're like, okay, Great. The problem is their frames per second is still limited by the green line, which is the GPU. So if they didn't get a faster GPU, they're not going to experience that 20% difference, right? So this is why it's both important in a CPU review to make sure you're CPU limited so you can fully establish what is the maximum differential you will see between these when you are in CPU limited scenarios. But again, for the end user, it's very, very possible that the answer to the question, how would upgrading to this CPU impact my gaming experience, is not at all. Now, it does get more complicated than this, though, because I don't know if I really need to get into the weeds on this, but let's go ahead and talk a little bit about it anyway. Because you can also look at the 1% lows in CPU reviews, and a lot of CPU reviewers will cover that, because a lot of times during gameplay, there's going to be these momentary spikes of additional burden on the CPU. Maybe you're transitioning into a new area in the game, so it's suddenly there's a bunch of draw calls, or it's loading in a whole bunch more stuff. And sometimes, or maybe you're even getting shader compilation, which happens on the CPU. And if that's the case, then it's very possible that you're getting these frame time spikes where momentarily the CPU performance does dip below the GPU performance, and your CPU is impacting these 1% lows, these little frame time spikes. And it's possible that if you buy a fast enough CPU, that you'll actually be able to deal with these spikes a little differently with the same GPU. Because if we're getting these spikes on the blue CPU, if they don't spike so far that they get beyond the restriction of the GPU flow, you can sometimes notice improvements in your 1% lows, those little stuttery experiences with a faster CPU, even if your average frame rate doesn't actually improve very much in moment-to-moment gameplay. Also, there's the issue of, what game are you playing? What scene of the game are you playing? I've been talking about these GPU, CPU bottleneck situations a lot in my last several videos. So that's where I kind of want to get at here. So first of all, let's make sure we're very clear. If you want to know which CPU is faster and by how much when you're in CPU limited scenarios, which is what I think a CPU review should do, it is correct to use this type of unrealistic gaming situation. But then it's just kind of on the viewer to understand that a 20% faster CPU may or may not always give you 20% better performance depending on, how the settings that you're using. But then the problem is, how do we actually answer this question? The question that a lot of viewers actually want to know the answer to. How would upgrading to this CPU impact my gaming experience? And my problem is, like I literally want to throw this question to you guys, because I've been thinking really hard about this, and I'm not sure if I can think of a good way to answer it in a meaningful way for a large percentage of viewers. Which I think makes sense then why CPU review content can't really be geared this way. Because, whether you're CPU or GPU limited can depend heavily on what game you're playing, what scene of the game you're in, and what monitor resolution you're using, whether you use upscaling like FSR or DLSS, what exact GPU and CPU do you currently have. And you guys see how we're getting into the weeds on this, because if you change any one of those variables, the scene of the game you're testing, even if it's a game that you play, the rendering resolution you're using, the monitor resolution, which CPU do you have currently? Is it really bad or is it already pretty good? Which GPU are you using? You guys see the problem, right? So if this is the question you want the answer to, hopefully you're maybe a little bit more sympathetic to why CPU reviews aren't done that way, right? Because again, how do we do that? Now, I'm not actually a CPU reviewer, so I don't really have a dog in this race or a horse in this fight, or I feel like I maybe mixed which animal with which metaphor, but you kind of get the idea. Anyway, the point is, I would be somewhat interested in trying to approach this type of content, though, although I don't own a lot of different CPUs, so it makes that a little bit difficult. I do own a lot of GPUs, so maybe you have to look at, okay, let's pair a certain CPU with a wide number of GPUs at different monitor resolutions and games, and then pick one other CPU and pair it with those same variety of GPUs. In other words, I think what this isn't actually a CPU review. This is more of a whole system or whole build review, if that kind of makes sense, right? You almost have to look at the entire system and how it's performing, and then change one or two components in that system. How does it compare afterwards, right? This gets very complicated. So anyway, CPU reviews are done in a way that makes sense for the question they're trying to answer. If you want this question answered, it's just a hard question to answer. So the main takeaway is, as a viewer, just understand what you're looking at, right? Because you're not necessarily going to always get the CPU performance gain. But what this kind of review definitely is good for is somebody who's building a whole new system, right? So if you're building an entire new system and you want to choose which CPU is the best value, best performance per dollar, or just best overall, this absolutely helps you answer that question, right? Because if you don't own a CPU already, you're not looking at, would I really get this performance gain? You're more looking at, well, if I'm spending this amount of money, which CPU for that price gives the best performance? Because if they cost the same anyway, I might as well get the one that performs the best for my use case. Anyway, I think that's probably where we should end it here. I was just kind of musing on this given our recent bottleneck discussions and the fact that we're about to get a bunch of new CPU reviews out there. So maybe you guys found it useful and or interesting. If you did, consider hitting the join button to support the channel directly. If not, totally understand. Also, huge thank you to viewers, commenters, subscribers, all of you. You're all beautiful people, and I hope you have an excellent day.